Hello and welcome to a very special edition of Current Affairs on JTV. Now, all of you I'm sure are familiar with the name of Baroness Jenny Tonge, who over the past decade has made a series of inflammatory comments relating to the Israel-Palestinian conflict that many believe have veered from being just anti-Israel and into the realm of anti-Semitism. So it's a great pleasure that I had the opportunity of interviewing Baroness Tonge earlier today to enable her to put the record straight. Jenny, thank you for joining me in the JTV studio.
Thank you for asking me.
Now, we're going to have a discussion, obviously, on the Middle East, on Israel-Palestine. But before we get to that, I'm curious about your earlier life, before politics almost. I'm wondering how a nice girl from Dudley got mixed up in the mess of Middle East politics.
Well, it's one of those things that it happened, didn't it? But
how?
Well, first of all, I've always been interested in politics. My parents were school teachers and we were always engaged in political discussions at home. So I've always been interested in politics. I went to girls' grammar school in Dudley and decided I wanted to do medicine. So got into University College and University College Hospital afterwards, which everyone's very thrilled about. The first medic in my family, and it was a great thing. Carried on being faintly political, but more in medical student politics, really, while I was a medical student. Met my husband. We dissected the same corpse, you'll be glad to know. That's how I met him.
How romantic.
Very romantic, but very bonding, I must tell you. And then I carried on doing medicine and didn't really think very much about politics, although I joined the Liberal Party as a student, as I could, once I was 18. And but wasn't really an activist because doing medicine and junior hospital doctoring was
rather time-consuming.
Time-consuming.
So how did it emerge then?
Well, then I had my children and I was working part-time, and we eventually, after a long way round, moved to Kew Gardens, Kew in Richmond. And I was very quickly snapped up by the local political organisation then, because the Liberals were actually very strong in Richmond at that time. I'm talking about the early 70s. Mm-hmm. I became eventually a ward councillor on Richmond Council, chair of social services with my medical background. I was still working. By this time, I was working full-time in the health service. But I became very political, very interested in local issues and in national issues. And when the seat became vacant in 1992, I'd already been selected as a local person, local councillor, mum with 3 children in local schools, plus a medical degree. It was quite I suppose I was a reasonable package.
Yes.
And I didn't get in 92, which you remember, I always call it the Kinnock election, sadly, but then won in 1997.
Okay, but Israel-Palestine, your medical background makes perfect sense. National issues makes perfect sense. I'm curious, when did this first enter your consciousness?
Well, this was the strange thing, that having chaired the party's health panel and done a lot of work on health issues, with a lot of experience on health issues, because my husband was by that time a consultant in a teaching hospital, so we got a broad range of experience. As soon as I became elected to Parliament, the party leader, Paddy Ashdown, made me international development spokesman.
Right.
It's the sort of thing that happens to you when you become an MP. And my husband's reaction, I remember, was to go out and buy me an atlas.
I see.
That was the problem, that I'd dropped geography a long while ago to do the sciences. But then I became very, very involved in international development because women's health was my passion, and obstetrics and gynecology, and that's very relevant to international development. So I got very interested. But then in 2003, here it comes, I was sent out to look generally at the humanitarian situation in the West Bank and Gaza.
Sent out by whom?
Sent out with the blessings of my party. I was in fact sponsored at that time by Christian Aid, I think.
Right.
I think it was.
So they said, come on a trip, go and have a look.
Come on a trip, come and see what's going on. And for me, that was a life-changing experience, actually. I couldn't believe it. I had been brought up in the Church of England, a very faithful member of the Church of England. And for us, Israel was part of our being. I don't expect Jewish people to quite understand that, but the relationship between Christianity and Judaism is very strong. And we know all the Bible stories, the Old Testament stories. And the fact that the Jewish people had, I think the Holocaust was the worst thing that ever happened to
full stop.
Human people,
right.
Full stop. Because of its industrialization and its deliberate planning. And it was absolutely horrendous. And I was a war baby, so I'd heard about this. I'd seen things on television as I was growing up. And I couldn't have been more pro-Promised Land, more pro-Israel as a young woman.
But having not visited, you hadn't visited?
Never visited.
Right. My mother did.
Okay. My mother did, because she was, and came back absolutely, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And isn't it a wonderful thing to have happened? So my first visit was in 2003.
Really? So that was literally your first engagement with the subject?
Yes. I hadn't been out there, and before that, I'd been part of the Foreign Affairs team for the Liberal Democrats. Ming Campbell was our Foreign Affairs spokesman, and I'd sometimes done speeches for him. And, there was always this very balanced approach to what was going on. I went out in 2003, and frankly, I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. The one word that summed it up for me, apart from all the horrors on both sides, was humiliation. And I think the Palestinians over decades have been humiliated over and over and over again. And you have to be there, and you have to be at the checkpoints, and be in the villages, and Hebron, go to Hebron, see those places and realise that humiliation is a huge, huge thing out there. Horrible.
So I take on board this
how
you got into this area, right? But I'm now curious. So your first visit was 2003. As you said, you had a certain view beforehand. You come to the West Bank, you see that, and you come in with a very different view in that sense. But what I'm puzzled about is a statement you say, for example, about humiliation. You say for decades. But that was your first visit. So how did you feel so confident to make such a strong statement just from that visit?
No, that is what I felt there.
Oh, you felt it, okay.
I felt humiliated myself on behalf of the Palestinians, in a way. I imagined myself in that situation.
Right.
And since then, I have noticed, I've been out there several times since, I notice this constant, as well as the brutality, as well as the violence that comes from both sides, I accept that, but as well as the brutality by the IDF soldiers and the theft of land and the destruction of crops and the demolition of houses, as well as all of those things, there is this underlying theme of making them feel less than anybody else. I'll give you one example. In Bethlehem, they're having great difficulty with water supply. I can't remember which year it was, but they hadn't got much water. It was coming 2 or 3 times a week, if they were lucky. And driving out of Bethlehem, we saw a settlement on the way to Jerusalem. I can't remember which one even. But I remember there were sprinklers on the lawns of the houses in that settlement. Now, that to me sort of summed it up, that it wasn't just that they were short of water and struggling, it was they could see water being wasted a few miles away, and that is humiliating.
So you think, are you saying that humiliation, therefore, is at the core of the Israel-Palestine conflict, or is there something else at the core of it? It's very core. What's going on there?
Well, I think the other core, and this, of course, the other factor, very, very strong factor, is I don't think the present Israeli government, or I suspect previous Israeli governments, ever had any very great intention to actually pursue the two-state solution, and wanted to get as much of the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan as they could. I would certainly make that accusation against Netanyahu and his government at the moment. I don't,
So there hasn't ever been an Israeli government that you have approved of?
I don't know them well enough. I can't answer that question. I mean, I'm talking about, I became involved and looking at what was going on from 2003-4 onwards. And the political side was never my concern, really, because I was international development.
Oh, no,
and
I
was looking
that.
at the humanitarian conditions and the conditions of the
No, and I agree, and that obviously is very important. But given your subsequent immense interest in the area, how have you educated yourself about the history, about the past? In the very fact, for example, you've said to me just now you don't know enough about Israeli governments to judge that. Well, you'll know, for example, surely the basic research would have shown you that the Oslo Accords occurred because Yitzhak Rabin's government took a brave step for peace in that regard. So what's been your educational process?
Well, my educational process has been going out there and wondering if there can ever be a solution if there is such brutality and humiliation going on.
But going out where? Let's start. Where do you go out?
You're talking about. You always want to talk about history, and I've noticed that people will always go back and say, talking about history. It's the here and now we've got to deal with. It's the situation that we're in now, that the people in the Middle East are in now, that has to be dealt with. And history may be terribly important in the background, but actually you've got to deal with the situation, and you cannot have the present situation continuing. There are three solutions. Either it continues with the most horrendous situation for both sides, because it seems to me that when I was in West Jerusalem last, people are still afraid. They're terribly afraid, and they have every right to be afraid that there may be someone going to attack them around the corner. But also, for the Palestinians, it's a constant knock on the door, invasion of their house, may be demolished. So that situation could continue. If that's what everybody wants, it will continue. Or there could be a two-state solution where there is a huge problem because of the settlements, which, despite all the agreements and accords and conferences and the so-called two-state solution peace conferences that have gone on, have been, to me, just a cloak for continued building in the settlements. I mean, the settlements now and the roads connecting them have just made the West Bank a non-area, really. I mean, it's not a continuous area. So you can either have that. If you've got two states, you've got to do something about the settlements and all those fine roads that have been built. I cannot see the Israeli government wanting to demolish all of those settlements, to go back to the 1967 line which everyone talks about, with East Jerusalem, which is now annexed, East Jerusalem as the capital of the Palestinian state. Well, the third solution is one state.
Okay.
Now, a lot of people are coming around to the idea that the best solution, and it's inevitable, it's going to be one state. Well, that's fine, but can you have a one-state, true democracy with two basic sorts of people living there, and call it a Jewish state? And I think that's the big problem.
So it'd be a binational state, is what you're saying?
It would have to be a secular state, respecting all religions and giving equal rights to all its citizens. And maybe that is possible, but I don't feel the vibes of possibility coming from the present government of Israel.
Okay, it's interesting you've outlined those points. I think, that's all, as you say, sort of a reasonable look at possible solutions and how they've worked out. But I'm curious about one thing, and it comes down to the conversation we had a little before that answer, which is, again, this look of history and beyond. And I'm hearing from you either one of two things. Either you're not interested in history, or you just don't think it matters. Because, as you said, it's about the here and now, not what happened in the past. Which of those is it?
It's about the here and now.
So it doesn't matter, is what you're saying. The history doesn't matter.
I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm just saying we should dwell less on it and stop thinking about it. I mean, I could think about the history of my husband's family, who reputedly were Huguenots who came over from France after being persecuted. The history of that family, are they entitled to go back to France and claim their lands back where they were driven from? I mean, history is... there is too much emphasis on it. You've got to look at the future. I like people who are constantly looking forwards, looking at the future, being optimists, and not saying, oh no, you can't have that because this happened 100 years ago, or this. Well, let's look at the future. We know what the situation is now. We know what the difficulties are. Goodness, we know what they are. Let's find a solution and not refer constantly to the past.
Agree that it's great to look for solutions, but there are of course many who say without understanding and learning from the mistakes of the past, you will be condemned to make them again in the future. So again, I just come back to this point. How much of the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict have you studied?
I wouldn't say I've studied it, but like any politician who is also a doctor, which is the main part of my work, of course I have followed events and the various agreements that they've tried, but it seems to me that it's all a fog of failed treaties, failed arrangements, failed accords. Everything has failed in the past, but everyone is continuing, for instance, to continue with the idea that came from the Oslo Accords, that there would be a two-state solution. And I think that we've got to... I was glad that there was that conference in Paris yesterday, although sadly I don't think the British government were actually represented. I think they were there only as observers. But they were obviously trying to look at the future, at the now, and what's going to happen in the future. And I just want to make the point that I don't claim to be a historian of Israel or Palestine of anywhere. I've got a vague background. But I want to deal with the situation as it is now, with the misery and the persecution that a lot of Israeli people feel, and similar on the Palestinian side.
I hear that, but you've just referenced again your medical background. Let's imagine we're looking at a cure for cancer, and I said to you, I don't care about everything that's gone beforehand. I'm not interested. It hasn't worked. I'm only interested in a cure right now. You as a medic would laugh at me and say, but of course you have to take into account of what's happened in the past. We need to understand the different things we've tried in order to avoid making the same mistake. So why doesn't that hold true, Jenny, in this particular context? You need the history. You have to have the history, or else you can't possibly know where you're going next.
I think you have to have the recent history. I actually thought that you were probably referring more to ancient history.
What do you define as ancient history?
Well, the Old Testament
No,
for
I'm
a Christian. The Torah, you're not talking about that.
Yes.
But I'm talking about the history since the formation of the State of Israel.
So you
since
are...
the Balfour Declaration.
Right.
No, let's go back a little bit before that. The Sykes-Picot Agreement.
Right.
The Sykes-Picot Agreement, which actually a lot of people see was a sort of betrayal of the Arabs, because Lawrence of Arabia, had got them all together, and they were promised a caliphate if they supported the Western governments against the Ottoman Empire. I mean, that is my understanding. The Sykes-Picot Agreement after the First World War abandoned that promise and all the work that Lawrence had done, and they divided the Middle East up. At the same time, there was a big movement coming from, can I call them Zionists? I mean, it's always very difficult. You get into terrible trouble using certain terms. But there was a Zionist movement in Britain and America to find a land for the Jews, because Jews over centuries have been persecuted. And everyone knows that. And that is a terrible thing that has happened. I've already referred to the Holocaust. But even before the Second World War, the Jews had been persecuted in various countries, in Russia in particular. There had been pogroms. There is a history of persecution of the Jews, full stop. And something had to be done. Balfour, with pressure from some members of the British government and the Zionists, I shall call them, was pressured into making the Balfour Declaration.
You think Balfour was pressured into it?
Was he? I don't know. I wasn't there at the time. I did say that.
Yes.
I don't know. But I don't know Balfour, so he maybe thought it was absolutely terrific. But I think there were some Jewish members of Parliament at the time, weren't there, who were not too happy.
What have you read about this? And what's the best book you've read on this subject? On the Balfour Declaration, 1948. What's the best book?
I haven't read great tomes on it.
Don't you think that's a core problem in someone who has become so associated with this issue that you actually haven't read the literature, you haven't looked at that?
Listen, the core problem here is not the history or what literature you read or what you can spout on the history of a particular country. It's the fact that a great injustice has been done to the people who were in Palestine for centuries before the State of Israel was created. And I'm trying to say to you, I was a great enthusiast for the State of Israel to be created. I thought it was a wonderful thing, and I was totally supportive. Even as a little child, I was made to feel that way. And I believe in Israel's right to exist, and I wish it every success. But it cannot go on with its present policies of injustice towards the Palestinian people, who in many cases, and many of them have been there long before any of the people in Israel have been there.
I get that, Jenny, I understand it, but we come back to this core point about not understanding the whole history and beyond. You've just referenced history to a certain point. You've said Palestinians have lived there for years before Israelis and others in this kind of context. Now, we come back to this point. What you're saying is, essentially, Jenny Tonge's view of Israel-Palestine is literally Jenny Tonge's view based on what she's seen. She hasn't augmented her knowledge by looking about anywhere beyond.
And what I've experienced, and yes, I have augmented my knowledge. I have read books by Garda Kami, by Ilan Pape. I've read books. Now you're going to tell me, you see, that I haven't read books written by the right people.
No,
whatever book you read, you will find it will come from one aspect or the other.
No, I'm not going to say that, but I'm going to say to you, do you not think that, again, someone who is so involved in this and has been so involved in her political career in this ought to at least have taken a contrary view here and there and read something serious from them?
I'm not involved in any political sense. I've never been a spokesman for foreign affairs in my party.
No, but you have personal interest in it, and you've spoken out on it.
I have spoken out when asked, and I have been misquoted time and time again, and I have become a creature that everyone likes to criticise because of the things I've said that have been misinterpreted.
Okay, well, we'll look at that in a minute.
But I've never been a spokesman for my party, ever.
But I'm curious,
So
I agree you've not been a spokesperson.
I have a different brief.
But you do have, of course, a personal interest, and you have spoken out, whether misquoted or not, on the subject. So one would normally expect someone who takes a public position, as you have on this, to have at least a broad view of it. Now, let's just look for a second about some of the things you've said.
Is justice not a broad view?
Well, justice is. But
is the concept of justice not the most important thing?
Absolutely.
International law and justice and human rights.
Any court, as you well know, would take both sides.
I'm talking about the now.
I agree with you.
And I've already said to you that in my view, Israel has a right to exist, and I want it to be well, and I think it's a fantastic country. And I want peace and security and justice for them. But at the moment, compared with the Palestinian people, they've got it in spade loads. I'm just saying I want a bit more of it for Palestinians.
I get that, of course, and I understand it. But you mentioned a second ago that you feel you've been misquoted and misunderstood or misinterpreted in this way.
Many times.
It's no secret there have been many comments that have been said. I'll read a few of them out to you, and we can discuss what you felt you were saying versus what others felt you were saying. So, for example, you said back in 2004, January 2004, you suggested you understood the reasoning behind Palestinian suicide bombers and could consider becoming one, because you said, if I'd been a mother and a grandmother in Palestine, living for decades in that situation, I don't know, I may well have become one myself. Now, do you think that's right or sensible for anyone, let alone an MP, to say that in the way you said it?
I said, I don't know, I may well have become one myself.
Yes.
How can anybody possibly say what they would do in someone else's situation?
Well,
How can
you
you
just
say?
said it.
How can you say?
But you just said it.
I said, I may. I said,
Yes.
I don't know,
But
I may.
But why would you venture on
Well,
that ground?
I am not a Palestinian. I am not a Muslim. I do not live in that situation. But you have to empathise with people in that situation to try and understand where they're coming from. And I think a lot of people feel, I think Cherie Blair said a similar sort of thing about young men becoming suicide bombers. They are desperate. They do not see any future, and therefore they think that to take their own lives might be a better option. That's all I was saying. I was not endorsing suicide bombers. Wicked waste of life, wicked waste of life. I just don't know if in that situation, as a very passionate person, loving my family as I do, if I might not have wanted to take revenge. I don't know.
But do you not feel that you have, as a legislator in another country, do you not feel you have a moral example to set people? And what I mean by that is as follows. Your view is that the Palestinians have been set upon for decades. You've suggested here in your musings, well, maybe suicide bombing is a legitimate thing to do if you're in that circumstance. Why wouldn't you, as a Western legislator, say instead of that, actually empower Palestinians to get involved in civil rights movements, in terms of building a democracy in Palestine, in terms of building the state in that aspect? Why would you go to the suicide bombing aspect
that's
as
what
opposed
I've been trying to do.
To something else?
I didn't. It was because that was during the Second Intifada, if you remember, when there were a lot of suicide bombings going on. And in fact, the BBC took me out there after that remark to actually look at the families, to meet the families of suicide bombers and the families of their victims. And I visited the Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem, and I had a very, very interesting week. And I came back understanding how both sides felt, but not really needing to retract what I'd said, because I could understand the desperation of a very passionate Palestinian who felt there was no hope for the future, and the best thing they could do would be to make a grand gesture. It's just a matter of empathy. I think if you'd had a medical training, you might understand it better. No doctor can actually treat their patient properly unless they can empathize with them in the condition they're in. You can't tell them what they have to do. You have to say, what is the condition this person is in? How can we best deal with it?
But you can see how your remarks could have been construed by some who wanted to support
them.
No. So for some people who wanted to support suicide bombing as saying, actually, Jenny Tong has given us carte blanche. She understands this is fine.
What was not reported at the same time was that I was saddened and disapproved of suicide bombers because I thought it was a waste of life.
So do you condemn it?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Fine.
Of course I do, but
Fine.
I can understand why it happens.
Okay. September 2006, and I'm sure you're familiar with the Palestinian Solidarity event. You said the pro-Israeli lobby has got its grips on the Western world, its financial grips. I think they probably got a certain grip on our party. What did you mean by the suggestion of grips and financial grips on the Western world? What was that about?
Have you ever heard of AIPAC in the United States of America?
I have.
Have you ever heard of the sponsoring of members of Congress and the Senate? And
Sponsoring of what?
Financial sponsoring of their campaigns.
Who's sponsoring them?
AIPAC.
AIPAC don't sponsor any campaigns.
Well, somebody does. What I want
Americans
to say
do,
to
yes.
this, I know this is very hurtful, and I think of all the things I've said, it's probably the one that needs most investigation. What I want is for somebody to prove to me that I am totally wrong. That we have seen last week how the political process in Britain is being interfered with by, I'm sure you must be aware of the programmes that were on Al Jazeera last week, where there was political with financial interference.
Let's come on that in a moment.
And I just want you and anybody else who is worried about that remark to prove to me that I'm totally wrong, and
Jenny,
I'll be very happy.
Language matters. Let me explain why. Language matters. Had you said the influence of pro-Israel forces, people might have said, okay, don't agree, but nobody would have batted an eye. But you didn't say that, did you? You said, and I'll read it back again, the pro-Israeli lobby has got its grips on the Western world, its financial grips. That's a very different story. It's financial grips on the Western world.
Of all the things
you were
I've
imprecise,
said,
weren't you?
Of all the things I've said, I probably will accept to you that was a bit over the top. It was an exaggerated saying to say that, and it has all sorts of connotations. I know that.
So do you apologise for saying that?
I do apologise for saying that, but I do not withdraw my comment that there is a lot of interference in the political processes of America And as we saw last week, the political parties in this country, there is interference going on and money is changing hands, and that does worry me. And it is not, of course, it is not just the Israel lobby. It's all sorts of lobbies. In the United States, it's the gun lobby. Over here, a lobby that has a great influence on political parties is the countryside lobby. I would like to get me onto...
Is money changing hands?
I don't know in that case.
But what money is changing hands in the Israeli lobby's case?
What I want to say is, please, somebody prove to me that I'm totally wrong, and I'll be very happy. But can I say one more thing?
But I will. But politics in this country, as you know, is regulated. Donations are declared. When you say money is changing, unless you're suggesting paper envelopes are going around, brown paper envelopes.
Yes, I have been a member of a political party for long enough to know that there are ways around these things.
So you're saying, just so I understand, that in Britain today, secret funds are being funneled?
There could be. Well,
you can't say there could be. You have to either... you can't make the allegation unless...
I'm making the allegation, and I'm asking people to prove me that I'm wrong.
Come on, Jenny, that's not any kind of burden of legal or any other kind of proof works.
I would like someone to investigate, for instance, what Al Jazeera programs were doing and find out what BICOM, for example, is there for. So you think BICOM is funneling money into UK politics? I believe they might be. I don't know.
What makes you think they are? You've got no proof, correct? Let me just. You've got no proof of this.
Because of the sort of remarks that are made. I mean, the way everyone backs off if a criticism is made of Israel, everyone is afraid of making those criticisms or supporting the person who's made the criticism. If you were in British politics, you would understand it. Can you tell me why 80% of Conservative MPs belong to the Friends of Israel organisation? Why a lot of people in my party, my old party, a lot of people in the Labour Party feel they have to belong to the Friends of Israel organisation. There's no other country where that sort of thing applies. And I just want to know whether that is because of the very lavish and expensive trips maybe that they enjoy, or whether there is help in their constituencies with delivering leaflets, with all sorts of things. I just don't like the influence, and I don't like it from any lobby. And I just want to go further, and you must make me, let me make one final point. This is one of the sick things about Western politics. It applies to this country and it applies to the United States of America in buckets, is that they allow lobbyists, whether it's industrialists or the gun lobby, or there's all sorts of people who are allowed to finance and influence the political process. I think that's wrong. I would like to see state funding of political parties, a limit set on election money and how much you can spend. And then there would not be the corruption in Western politics.
So your view is, therefore, the politicians you mentioned, the 80% of the Conservative Party, the others who are scared, they don't really believe in Israel, they're not supportive of it, they're doing it for some other reason.
I don't know, ask them.
But
Jenny,
I
want to know why they feel they have to belong. Why they have to join.
So here's the issue then, here's the issue. I've given you a long opportunity to say your point there. What is confusing to me is that you've just said to me you have no proof of any of this. You don't know if this is happening. It's for them to prove the other way, if you like.
Yes.
So why then, rather than make these lurid allegations you just made, why didn't you go and investigate it before saying it? Why didn't you go and ask people? Why didn't you go and talk to them? Why didn't you do a proper project on this and look into it, as opposed to saying this happens with no proof?
And what on earth would happen to me if I did that?
Well, what would happen to you?
I have asked, I have made inquiries.
What would happen to you? Are you worried for your life?
I would. I have no idea what would happen to me, but I would not be a popular person.
No, but seriously, would you worry for your life?
Of course not.
Right.
Don't be ridiculous.
Well, then what
I'm an old woman. Why should I worry about my life anyway?
So then what could happen? What could possibly happen to you that you'll be worried about?
Well, I haven't got... If someone says to me, I don't like the money you're donating to a certain organisation, it is up for me to say, here is my bank account, here is my checkbook, investigate, show me where I donated it. I mean, I don't see that I have to investigate when I know from various sources that these things have happened.
So you do have proof then? You're saying you do have proof?
I don't have proof in the sense that I've got people who stand up and say, yes, this is happening.
Well, how do you know it's happened then?
Well, because it's flying around all the time, and it is up for the lobby to clear their own name. It's not up to me to clear their name.
But that's not the way it works. If I said, if I said Jenny Tonge is a murderer, okay, it's manifestly not true, but a number of people started saying it, that doesn't make it true, and that wouldn't be remotely sensible for me to say it or acceptable for me to say it. But it wouldn't be for you to clear your name in that context, would it? It would be, that guy's crazy, these people are crazy saying Jenny Tonge is a murderer.
I think it would be up to me.
So you think that in every case, so you don't believe in innocence until proven guilty, you believe in guilty until proven innocent, which is not the basis of our legal system in this country.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Okay.
Yeah,
so,
okay.
All right.
All right.
So you do believe in guilty before innocent?
30-15, yeah.
Okay. But it's not, I mean, some of your previous statements have echoed that. I mean, the case in 2010 about the organ harvesting and the IDF. Again,
now that was a deliberate lie.
Well, hang on. What I understand you said is not that the Israelis did it, okay, but that they needed to do an investigation into it because rumours were flying around about it.
I said if they were worried about it, they should do an investigation.
Right.
In fact, as a medical practitioner, what a nonsense thing that organs from an earthquake victim could be any use at all. I mean, it was a nonsense situation, and I made that comment.
But then, as you've just said, you are a medical person. You know it's nonsense.
Yes,
so why would the Israelis do an inquiry into it?
Why is it that
why would they do an inquiry?
There are all these things all the time around Israel, and why is it that everyone gets so terribly offended and upset? If they're patently, totally untrue, why get upset about it? Why not say, okay, we'll have an inquiry? I mean, there is an issue, there is a big issue worldwide about not having enough organs for people who require them. You know, there is a shortage of donor organs everywhere, in every country. I think Israel recently has made a new law, have they not, so that if you're not, you can't receive an organ if you need one, if you're not also on the organ donation register. Is that true? I don't know. I mean, I am always concerned about this because there was a move in this country to make it so that you had to opt out of organ donation. You didn't become an organ donor, as I am. I've got my card on me all the time. But that you had to opt out so that anyone who died could have their organs taken unless they'd made a specific agreement that would not happen to them. Now, I argue against that because it worries me that there then could be trafficking in organs. And we do know that there's worldwide trafficking in organs. And when I was approached, and that was the last time ever, I think, the Jewish Chronicle ever approached me to say what did I think about these rumours. And that is the answer I gave. I actually also congratulated the IDF for their magnificent response, because they are absolutely terrific at disaster response. And that's what I said. I congratulated them and said if they were worried about this, to have an inquiry to sort matters out. Perfectly innocent thing to say if you're a medical doctor, for goodness sake.
Quite agree. I mean, in terms of looking at, if you're praising the IDF for this and looking at that, that makes sense. Okay. Now, two final questions for you. The first is, on a couple of occasions, you have alluded to the fact that the Israel-Palestine conflict has been the root cause of terrorism worldwide. That's what you said in November 2010. And in July of 2016, the treatment of the Palestinians by Israel is a major cause of the rise of extreme Islamism and Daesh. Where do you get that from? Where does that come from?
Well, because I've watched it develop.
You've watched what develop?
I've watched extreme Islam develop and get worse and worse.
Okay.
And I mean, I think the first really sort of, there was Al-Qaeda, but then there was Hamas and Hezbollah that broke away from the rest in the Middle East. And
broke away from where?
From the Palestine I'm trying to think of it, the Palestinian Authority. I mean, Hamas was then the rival to Fatah.
Yes.
Fatah is
but what's
the
the relevance of that to ISIS and Al-Qaeda?
Israel is the link, because they have linked them. They are saying that Hamas is linked with ISIS and that Hezbollah is linked, and they're all extremists. So they are saying that that link exists. And where did they come from? I mean, I believe in the history books that I have managed to read, in the articles I have managed to read, that at one time the Israeli government was very supportive of the formation of Hamas because they were not getting on with Yasser Arafat. So they actually helped create it. But if you go to Muslim countries, you will find that what is happening to the Palestinians and what has happened to the Palestinians is something that is mentioned as what the West does to Muslims. And I'll give you one example. I was in Bangladesh long time ago, probably 10 years ago, 10 years ago. And I was speaking to some refugees left over from the Bangladesh-Pakistan war. And they were all Muslim, miles away in Bangladesh. And I was introduced as a British parliamentarian who had defended the right of the Palestinians and supported their rights. Now, I said, you know about that. And they said to me, those leaders of that community, well, that is what the West does to Muslims.
Right.
That,
okay.
and it has always worried me that sowed the seeds of resentment and extremism. And I'm not alone in thinking this.
But hang on.
There are many people
Jenny,
who think
again,
this.
that's not what you said. You didn't say it's a root of discontent. You said it's a root of terrorism. It's a very specific and very different thing. It's a very different thing here. Okay. Now, do you believe, for example, is that what? If we look at recent cases. Was the rise of bin Laden, was that to do with Israel-Palestine? Did bin Laden himself, was that the reason he went on his rampage?
No, I didn't mention bin Laden.
Yeah, but extreme Islamism in this context.
Yes, but you're talking about terrorism.
Baghdadi.
We're talking about terrorism.
Baghdadi of Daesh. Okay?
Look.
Did he come to power and did he come to the fore because of Israel-Palestine?
I think it has all been fueled by what has happened to the Palestinians.
What statement has Baghdadi ever made about Palestine-Israel?
He hasn't, but I'm telling you that people
that,
I think you're making assumptions too. How do you know that it doesn't make a link?
So I'm going on. No, but Jenny, I'm going on.
I want to just ask you about this terrorism thing.
I'm going on facts.
You're going on about terrorism.
Yes.
Look, there has been terrorism throughout the centuries. The people who formed the State of Israel, what about Irgun and Haganah and all of those movements? They were terrorists in every sense of the word. The people who blew up the King David Hotel, the things that went on in Palestine before the creation of the State of Israel, that was terrorism. Why do you always say terrorism as if it's a special thing that's been created by the Muslims?
No,
it hasn't. It's a nonsense.
But we're using your words. You said the treatment of Palestinians by Israel is at the root cause of terrorism worldwide. It's your words, not mine. Your words. Again, do you think you might have made a mistake in the choice of words you've used there? It's not terrorism, is it? It's not terrorism, is it?
Extremism.
Extremism, even?
Which leads to terrorism.
So you're saying that Israel is the reason why, for example, Al-Qaeda, Daesh, the Islamic Brotherhood.
What has happened? No, I said
Muslim
that.
Brotherhood,
I didn't say that. I didn't specify. I just said at the root cause of terrorism.
It's just too amorphous, isn't it, what you're saying?
Well, I think you're being extremely fussy. I don't think you realise how people actually out there talk and how they think.
My final question for you. You've stated on a number of occasions, I think in fact most recently there was a written question in January 2015. You asked Her Majesty's government whether they plan to encourage Jewish faith leaders of the United Kingdom publicly condemn settlement building by Israel and to make clear their support for universal human rights. Why would you ask specifically for Jewish faith leaders to do that in the UK? Are you suggesting that all Jews should be held responsible for Israel?
No, I didn't say that, and of course I don't. And
right.
I've got a lot of Jewish people who are friends of mine and who support me, and of course I would say that.
No, but I'm sure you do.
You know that's what's usually said. I think that if the Jewish faith leaders in this country were more vociferous about settlement construction, for instance, and were more critical of what is going on in Israel, they would get a lot more respect. One of the things...
Respect from whom?
From non-Jewish people. One of the things that worries me terribly is the way anti-Semitism is now being used all the time to silence people who are critical of the Israeli government. And if you look back at the sort of things I've been saying, I almost always, I can't say always, but I try always to talk about the Israeli government. I do not talk about the Jews ever. I do not talk about Israel even. I don't like to refer to the Zionists because I know there are some good Zionists. There are some Zionists who don't like what the Israeli government's doing. I just think that if people in this country, if the Jewish people in this country who really don't like the Netanyahu government would speak out and speak out loudly about the settlements, it would be very, very helpful all
But
while.
some do that.
Well, we don't hear them.
Okay. Do you think the British Muslim people should loudly attack ISIS, attack Daesh, attack...
Well, they do, constantly.
Well, so let's get this straight. So you hear them doing that, but not the Jews who attack Israel?
Well, I do
you don't
hear
that.
Yes, I've told you, I know a lot of Jewish people, and a lot of them, of course, they condemn the settlements. But I'm talking about
because you'll know that just as some British Jews clearly support the Israeli government, clearly, okay, there'll be some British Muslims who just support ISIS.
Well, let us hear a bit more criticism of the actions of the Israeli government from the Board of Deputies of British Jews and the Chief Rabbi. Let us just hear that they think the settlements are a bad thing and they are destroying any chance of a two-state solution. Let's just hear that from them. That would be good.
And if that happens, what's your reaction then?
I'd be delighted.
Be delighted.
I'd be delighted.
Okay.
Because I want Israel to succeed, and I don't want this horrible situation to go on where two peoples who've lived in the same part of the world for thousands of years can't continue to occupy it as they did before the State of Israel was created.
Let me ask you one final question, because it's something that's relevant at the moment. You've been placed under investigation by the Commissioner of Standards in the House of Lords over an issue of personal honour and of potentially misusing the premises. I'm assuming you defended your case in this. Mm-hmm. If you were to be found guilty of that, do you feel, once again, that may be an illustration of the power of the Israeli lobby?
Oh, let's wait and see what the verdict is. No, I hadn't considered that, no. I think the Commissioner of Standards in the House of Lords is entirely independent, and I would not expect her, it's her at the moment, I would not expect her to be influenced by any lobby.
So it's a legitimate complaint then, is what you're saying?
I didn't say that. I said I expect her judgment to be free of influence from any side. I'm not saying it's a legitimate complaint because I am not guilty of what the newspapers accused of me, which was based on erroneous hearing. And incidentally, the remark by a member of the audience at that meeting I was chairing was actually an Orthodox Jewish person. You do know that, don't you, from the Neturei Karta sect.
Well, they have their own issues, but they have their own issues.
Well, of course they have their own issues.
But you're saying you didn't hear the comment, though?
I didn't really hear it clearly enough. It was a rant, and I wanted to get on to the next speaker. I was looking for something, you know, when you chair a meeting and you can see everyone.
Of course.
I wanted to, that was the basis of that, and it was entirely misreported. But it's with the Commission of Standards now.
But he said the Jews are responsible for the Holocaust, right? Essentially.
Well, I gather he did. I didn't hear him say that.
But that's not something you agree with?
No.
Okay, and had you heard him, you'd have shouted, you'd have said no? Okay, in that context. Fine. Jenny, that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much for joining us today. And
once again, thanks for inviting me.
Pleasure, and thank you all. I will see you again soon for another episode of Current Affairs on JTV.